Welcome to Suddenly Different, where we explore stories and strategies for life when it doesn't go to plan. I'm Leigh-Anne Charland, inviting you to join me on this journey. Some moments mark us forever. At 19, my guest today, Katie Bingham, faced one of those moments when her ex-boyfriend ended his own life. It was sudden, it was devastating, and it changed the way she saw herself, her relationships, and the world around her. But Katie's story is not just about loss. It's about what happens after, about learning to live with PTSD, understanding her own neurodivergence, and turning pain into purpose by creating safe spaces where children who are wired differently feel truly seen, supported, and celebrated. Before we begin, a gentle note. Today's conversation includes discussion of suicide and mental health struggles. Please take care of yourself as you listen. If it stirs emotion, pause, breathe, reach out. You're not alone. This isn't a story about answers, although you will get answers. It is a story about honesty, hope, and the quiet kind of courage that keeps showing up in our lives. Katie, thank you.
Hi.
For being here.
You're welcome. Lovely to see you.
Yes. It seems like quite a while ago that we met at a networking lunch, and I don't know, we just ended up clicking and discovered that we had something to talk about.
Yeah, some stories to share.
As we were speaking before we started recording, until we have an awareness of something happening in life, we have no understanding of the weight or the emotion or the experience and how it's treated in society. And today I hope that through your experience, Katie, that we give our listeners just some insight into what it might be like if this happened to them without them having to go through the pain and the heartbreak that you have gone through.
Yeah, we're talking a reasonably long time ago now, and the world is quite a different place now. But yeah, without sort of leaping to the end of things, I hope that by sharing, maybe somebody feels a little less alone in their own struggles.
Yes. So, Katie, before the day that you got the news about your ex-boyfriend, who were you and who was he to you?
Yeah, so I was a high school student, a teenager. I was a dancer in a family of very sporty individuals. Classical ballet was my thing, and I absolutely adored it, and I was good at it without being egotistical, but I was striving for a professional career, which when you don't grow up in a big city is not exactly ordinary. So I was a little left of field in my peer group, my school cohort, but I was quite okay with that because I was so certain and driven in what I wanted to do and how much I loved it. So a lot of my decisions at that age were based around, is this getting me where I want to be going? And I was very clear about where I wanted to be going. So, I had fun at high school. I quite liked studying. I have an interest in lots of different topics. So I studied everything from visual arts to physics and, everything in between, really. The only thing I didn't particularly love was sport because even though I really liked the physicality of it, the competitiveness of it was something that just didn't resonate with me. I wasn't interested in having someone else be worse off so that I could feel better off, was, I guess, the way I felt it. I had some friends, but not hugely strong connections, largely. Like where I grew up, it was pretty common for people to have big groups of kids that all just kind of hung out together and went down to the river or hung out in the park or whatever people did. I was at dance class, so I wasn't kind of part of that. And that was by choice. I had people around and one or two close friends that really sort of understood me and what I was trying to do. But yeah, I probably wasn't in the kind of popular groups or anything like that. But it also didn't particularly bother me. And Lee was sporty. He wasn't super popular either. He was just a well-liked mate to lots and lots of people. We knew who each other were. We were at school together, but we kind of met when in year 11 at at my school doing your making your debut was kind of a thing. So I wanted to do that and be part of that process. And there were quite a few options around in terms of groups that did organise debuts and things like that. And so, of course, part of that process is looking for a partner. And there was someone I had in mind at the time initially, and it turned out that he had, several partners and several debs to be part of, and was kind of booked out in a way. And I had this one good friend who went, "Hey, have you ever thought of this guy? Like, he's not the top of most people's radars, but he's really lovely. You would have heaps of fun. And, if it's only ever platonic, that's fine," kind of thing. Like, he would make a great partner. And I thought, you know what? I don't really know him that well. So what the hell? I trust my friend. So yeah, I kind of approached him and he said yes. And we did. We had a great time going to lots of rehearsals and partying afterwards and all that kind of stuff. And through that process, we really got to know each other. And then, some point after that, we became boyfriend and girlfriend. And he was just a really lovely, chilled person who, everybody liked, because he was kind of one of those guys that's impossible not to just like. He was, I think the word is affable, although I never would have known that at that age, and just easygoing, easy to get along with, always up for a laugh, always up for a bit of an adventure. But he really sort of saw me as well, and our senses of humour matched quite well. And we just loved spending time together. And we just kind of hung out, and whatever else was going on in our peer group, teenage lives, whatever, just kind of didn't seem to touch us, which I really liked. We could just do the things that mattered to us. And at school, we didn't make a fuss about being together. We just kind of got on with our days. But yeah, he was just one of those really, really lovely, lovely people in life.
Yes. And so when you think of him now, do you have any recollections or any hindsight that he had within him, the thinking or the took him to make the choice that he did?
Yeah, certainly not at school. He was very just cheerful and got along, and though everything sort of seemed really chilled, we were together through our first years at uni. And when I look back now, I think he probably felt a fair bit of pressure from his family in some ways, because he was one of 3 kids and he was the only one that was really particularly academic. So he was likely to be the only one that went to uni, and he didn't really have huge aspirations for anything in particular, I think. He loved playing footy and he was good at it, but he wasn't particularly driven to try and be a professional footballer or anything like that. He was, he's really just kind of a happy-go-lucky kind of person. But the opportunity to go to uni came up and he took it. And I don't really know the family dynamics behind that, but I do know that when he came to Melbourne, he was boarding with a family where there were some issues, not with him, but within the family. There was some domestic violence and, things weren't great. And I know there was a small child involved, and he just felt helpless and kind of stuck, where he knew that these things were going on, but he couldn't do anything about it. But he also financially didn't have the capacity to move on or move out, and in a way didn't want to, because whilsoever he was there, he could keep an eye on things. So yeah, kind of that trapped and stuck feeling came in his living arrangements. But I think also uni was difficult. He didn't really know anyone in his course or anything like that to start with. Growing up in the country, you come to the city for uni and everybody's kind of scattered to the wind. You don't necessarily end up with people or with people doing similar courses or those sorts of things. And of course, we're talking about a time before the internet, before social media, all those sorts of things that keep us connected more these days. And at that stage, even mobile phones weren't a thing. So you had a big phone bill if you made lots of phone calls, particularly interstate phone calls. And yeah, so I think the disconnect was really difficult while he was also under some pressure. And yeah, at some point he made the choice to move away and do a different course, which I think was a combination of feeling like the course didn't suit him, but also needing to get away from that situation. And he ended up in another city, but living in a caravan, because that's what finances dictated and the availability of housing, that sort of thing. So again, he was very kind of on his own and sort of struggling to make ends meet, struggling with the academics. We weren't together in terms of physical location very often. I was madly 100% into my dance course, and the hours on that were, 8 till 6, 5 days a week. And life was pretty intense for me. And I kind of felt like we drifted apart over that first year of uni and sort of even into the second year. So while I know some of what was going on, I certainly don't feel like I know the whole story. And I guess that's one of the things that, looking back, I go, if I'd been more connected, if I'd known more, maybe I would have realised. But, at that 19-year-old stage, when you're moving forwards with your adult life, you're not necessarily staying connected to your old life. So that's just kind of the reality of how that is for people now, but also was for us in that instance. So I decided in the September school holidays of our second year at uni, and we really hadn't spoken much for probably 6 months at that point, to say, look, this is not going to be a thing moving forwards. We were both hometown for holidays. So we caught up in person, and I just said, hey, this is not a thing. There's no animosity. Nobody did anything wrong, but we're not together. So there's sort of no point moving forward in terms of calling it a relationship. And he was obviously upset and obviously, not feeling great. But when you break up a long-term relationship, that's kind of expected. So that didn't cause any red flags either. He tried to come and see me a couple of days later and talk. And I just went, look, there's not really anything to talk about. There's not, nothing's going to change. And that's possibly my one regret, was not hearing him out, because maybe at that point he would have said something or I would have picked up on something, but you do what's in front of you at the time. So that's just that. And then that night we were all, hometown, you go out with the mates and everybody's out in one way, shape or form. So we weren't out with the same group, but we were both out. And I came back to Melbourne the next morning, and that afternoon I had a visit from my parents in Melbourne, very unexpectedly. He'd gone home after that night out and taken his own life.
And I understand if it's too difficult to answer this next question, but it's a serious, sudden meeting of your parents. So I can imagine that, your body's sort of going, what's going on? Something's clearly happened somehow to someone. And then they give you the news, which they clearly felt the only way to do it was in person. Now, how did you feel? And did it feel like your world shifted, like in that moment, or was there a numbness? What was that like for you?
So I was ironically in a dance rehearsal, which was the reason I'd had to return to Melbourne sort of on the early train. And so Mum and Dad appeared at the dance studio door, and my first reaction was, hi, welcome, you're in my world, they come to see me. And then very quickly the penny dropped, hang on, you don't belong here, this doesn't fit, and I only saw you 12 hours ago. What? And, there were other people in the rehearsal and things. And I don't actually remember which one of them, but one of them gestured, just like, come out here kind of thing, come outside the studio. I remember the vision of seeing them at the door really clearly, but I don't remember what they said. And I know that I just went back into the studio and said, this has happened, I've got to go. And the people I was rehearsing with just going, yep, go. And that was that, just grabbing my stuff. And internally, I think it was really my first experience of death of anyone that I knew particularly closely. My mum and dad are English, and they moved out from England before I was born. So we don't even have never had extended family, grandparents, that kind of thing that we've known particularly closely. So even though some of them had passed, they weren't people I was close to or connected to. So whilst I knew that obviously that death is not reversible and that that's the end of it and you're never going to see them again, and, the sadness and all that kind of thing, I'd never actually experienced it before. And so on the one hand, there was this complete numbness. Like, I'd heard the words and I'd understood them, but I couldn't access any real feeling at that point. You see in the movies or, even in life, some people, it hits them deeply and straight away and they're sobbing, and it wasn't like that for me at all. Yeah, it was just numb. And somewhere in my head was like, what am I supposed to do now in terms of quite a practical supposed to? So I got my stuff and we went downstairs, and I got in the car and we drove to my flat and I packed a bag. And I remember I think I said to Mum, do I need to, I guess I need to pack something black because, you know, that's what you do for a funeral. Or, yeah, just this sort of, and then somehow putting together some stuff and getting in the car again and Dad just driving. And I just sat in the back seat. And it was a 4.5 hour drive and much of it was silent. I don't even really remember having thoughts. It was just, I have to get there. And there was no denial. There was no sense that Mum and Dad are lying to me or it can't be real or whatever, because I had a very strong sense that obviously if they were there and saying this, then it was real. You know, at some point through the trip, I asked how and what happened, or, who found him, or, those sorts of practical questions, I guess. But yeah, the rest was just kind of blank. Maybe even some thoughts of, like his family, but not really questioning what they were going to think of me or say to me or any of those things. It was just numb. I don't know, I just couldn't access any of the feeling stuff.
Katie, you've spoken about that numbness and the silence, which it is our natural body's response to shut down. These things are such a surprise and such a shock that our autonomic nervous system is protecting us from an extreme reaction. But is that natural response of shutting down, do you think that that's sometimes misread by others? And for you, what was it like to carry that misunderstanding on top of your grief?
It certainly was accepted in the first instance. There was a car trip home. There was no push from my parents to talk or any of that kind of stuff. I think they understood in that instant that whatever response you have is what you need to be able to have. But in the days following, I feel like I stayed stuck. Not that I was judging myself at the time, but I feel like I stayed stuck in that state for quite a long period of time, a week or two rather than a day or two. And at some point, people started to misunderstand that it wasn't just a elongated period of the same thing. They started to read other things into it. I'm thinking maybe it was the next day or a couple of days later. We spent quite a bit of time at his parents' house, just sort of being around, which wasn't comfortable, but was the right thing to do. And yeah, at one point I heard his parents behind closed doors, clearly worried about me. I think I literally had got up to go and get a glass of water from the kitchen or something, and the kitchen door was closed. And I overheard them saying, Katie hasn't said a word. She hasn't even cried. She's going to be next. And that was quite sort of a whole other layer of shock, I guess. That numbness, as you say, is kind of a protective layer. And hearing that really just kind of broke that protective layer to a degree, just kind of went, well, hang on. There's other people are reading into it, something that I wasn't feeling. And I had a sense that I couldn't and shouldn't and didn't really want to change how I was reacting in an outward sense. Like I've never been one to fake things for the sake of other people necessarily. And so I didn't want to suddenly start talking just because it was easier for everybody else. But I was also very clear in my own head that what they were suggesting wasn't right and that it would never be right. Yes, it was a shock. Yes, it was full on. Yes, it was devastating for me and for lots of other people. And I'm aware that now I'm talking about it quite clearly and cleanly, but we are talking 30 years ago and, I'm medicated and all sorts of other things that mean that I don't readily get upset these days. And I'm quite kind of pragmatic about things. So I don't want the fact that I can be sort of clean and articulate about it to add to the judgment layer of, the sense that there was no feeling happening, because there certainly was, and there has been over a long period of time. But yeah, the fact that moment was a real realization of what they were perceiving, not necessarily everybody was perceiving, but that they were perceiving. And I so clearly remember just going, they will never be right. I won't let this break me.
Yes.
I won't let this change my story. I've worked too hard for what I want. And of course, I would never wish anyone and particularly him, harm. And I think there was sort of a desperation in my own head to cling to the idea, and it was accurate, that I didn't know, that I couldn't do anything because I didn't know. But there were some people in our lives generally, like some of our peers who we hadn't been at school for more than a year and a half at that point. So they weren't really actively in our lives, but a number of those people, there were whispers that it was my fault, that there was something I should have or could have done. That the fact that I'd prioritized my career over the relationship had somehow broken him. All sorts of insinuations and, grief people grasp at straws. And I get that on a logical level. But yeah, there was certainly a lot going on that I couldn't control and that didn't feel right.
Yes.
But I was also so overwhelmed in my own sort of stillness. And it kind of felt like the emotions had to kind of, I don't know, like filter through a really thick sponge or something. Like it was there, but I couldn't feel it.
Yes.
Like it just hadn't hit me yet.
Yeah.
Even though logically, and, academically, I knew what had happened, but the
Yes.
feeling part hadn't hit me. And it did actually take a couple of weeks. And I think looking back, that I couldn't let myself go there until I knew it wouldn't break me, if that makes sense.
And that's where no two people react the same way. There's some cultures, rituals that are wailing rituals, and some cultures have huge celebration rituals. And there is no textbook ideal way to respond to tragedy. And it was a tragedy.
Yeah. And I feel like it's, I've since lost my dad, and that was an entirely different thing because we saw it coming.
Yes.
We knew he was unwell. We knew he wasn't going to make it. You get a chance to say all the things you need to say. You get a chance to kind of unpack your feelings about the relationship before it happens. You get a chance to celebrate life together. Whereas this was a total shock, total blindside that no one saw coming. His family didn't see it coming either, and he was staying with them. Certainly friends had no idea. I think sort of unpacking it years down the track, we realised that he really had distanced himself from a lot of people in maybe the week or two leading up to it. He clearly had a plan. And when I look back now, I go, yeah, that's probably why he wanted to talk to me, to make sure that in whatever way he would have figured it out in his head, to kind of somehow make me realise that we were okay even through the breakup, because he'd already decided.
Yeah.
That was going to be his eventuality, and he didn't want anyone to know. People who cry for help find a way for people to know, or find a way to not succeed. He didn't tell anyone, hid it perfectly, and succeeded. And there was nothing anyone could have done.
Yes. And I know in recent podcasts, I had my friend Michael, and he got to the brink. He got to the action point, and just logistically, he didn't think he'd succeed, and he didn't want to fail. Nobody around him knew that it was happening, and he did that on purpose, and he knows he did that. So there are the different mindsets and the different behaviours of those who want to succeed, but it doesn't change for you the fact that you were experiencing post-traumatic stress, and that you have post-traumatic stress disorder even now. And that is, and as you said before, that you have coping mechanisms that help suppress the extremes and keep you safe.
Yep.
And keep you functioning, and you have purpose and wonderful things in your life that you do now, but you have been affected by this significant event. And I know that when we spoke about you being on the podcast, your goal was to help anybody who was in a similar situation to find sense and find whatever level of peace or understanding they could have.
Yeah. I think I realised, I don't know, at some point 6, 12 months down the track that talking things out loud didn't actually make them any worse, that I'd already managed to put one foot in front of the other through what was the hardest part, or, one of the hardest parts. And yeah, I think it's just kind of, it's in my nature to want to help people and to want to just to help people understand themselves and to put words to things that are hard to find words for, because in my experience, that kind of naming and articulating things gives them less power in a brain where you've got maybe a negative mindset for whatever reason, whether it's an anxiety, a depression, a PTSD, or whether it's trauma-based, that if you're struggling, to be able to put words to something actually helps you to understand it and helps you to articulate it to other people.
And I think also when you're able to put words to it, I feel there's like an alchemic change, that there's a dissolving or modifying feeling, or like sometimes when we speak about traumatic events, they can re-injure and re-escalate, and sometimes talk therapy doesn't help dissolve. But then there are other times, and I think that my next question was to you is how does that PTSD or that traumatic experience live in your body before you're able to language it, so that because I know my ability to experience joy and spontaneity and those sorts of things, those sorts of freedom-based things have been affected by my traumatic life experiences. Yeah. So, and I know now that I am experiencing joy, sort of face down the barrel of the gun. I experience joy more physically, which you would have been doing in your dance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, dance for me became a combination of the kind of joy and self-expression that I'd always had, was kind of reined in and limited to a degree to that physical exertion and that physical expression that is, I don't know, it became less joyful but more settling, if that makes sense. It became part of my way of regulating my nervous system, I guess. And it also became a safe way to express how I was feeling, because having done so much training, I felt in control of it. It wasn't going to overwhelm me, because as long as I kept moving, I knew there was kind of a way through it. And I also kind of discovered that one of my other coping mechanisms was sleep, basically.
Yes.
Because when I sort of have to loop back a little bit, which is to say that in order to be okay with what Leigh did, I really had to understand how he could make that choice, and try and figure out the why, but also just that, I don't know, it gave me a really deep understanding of the fact that living is a choice we make every day, and to a degree every minute, and that there is another choice to be made. And most people don't think about it because, we're just alive, we're doing what we do. But it really held up the fact that actually there is another option. And while you're heightenedly aware of that other option, you need to make a choice, and you need to make a choice regularly. And there were days when the choice that he made seemed logical, I guess is the right word. And while I was very determined that his parents in the kitchen that day were never going to be right, I was never going to be next, that didn't mean that I spent time standing alone on top of 4 bridges with traffic flowing underneath, imagining what it would be like, or driving down the road and just visualizing veering off into a massive tree, or, and then being consciously aware of making a different choice. And I didn't doubt my own strength to keep making that choice. I was very determined that that would never be the actuality of it. But I kind of needed to understand it in a really visceral way. Like, what would it feel like to be right on the brink of that choice? So sometimes there were times when the only way to keep choosing life was to go to bed and know that I would wake up with a different feeling in the morning, and that when putting one foot in front of the other in daily life was too hard, my opt-out was to sleep because I knew it was a safe opt-out. And so that's where the other side of the dance came into it, was that if I danced long enough and hard enough, I would be exhausted enough to actually sleep. So for a long time, I went from dance to sleep, from dance to sleep. And it was, it felt kind of productive in that it was still getting me further along the path to that profession that I had pushed for so long. So I certainly had no intention of stopping or of changing my goal, because then if our peers were in some way right that I was a part of his choice, then I didn't want it to be for nothing. I didn't want to have pushed myself this hard and maybe pushed him away or made different choices for this thing and then given up on it. So yeah, there were lots of factors that kind of kept me moving. But then there were barriers there as well. I was part of a course and everyone was well aware of what had happened, but I would be in class, and once I started moving, sometimes the tears would come. And I would keep dancing, but the tears just rolled and rolled and rolled and rolled. And I remember one teacher in particular, I know exactly who it is, but I'm not going to name them, who pulled me aside one day and went, "You are bringing the rest of the class down. You have to stop this. If you feel upset, then go into the toilets and cry on your own." And as a teacher and as a parent and as a, human, I really can't fathom that. I mean, I understand that it must have been having an impact on the people around me to see me in that state. But to not understand the sort of impact of shaming someone into hiding when they're in that state, or to, prioritize other people who are otherwise coping and fine over someone who clearly is not. Yeah, I will never understand that. But
No,
ballet
and
mistresses are a law unto themselves. It's a fairly
yeah,
extreme situation. It is what it is. But
and
yeah, thankfully there were other people around who were not that way inclined. So
and what an alternate solution could have been the greatest of education opportunities,
yeah,
with like giving people the ability to understand that they and only they are responsible for how they feel,
yeah,
and that um being compassionate and showing patience and like all of these things are possible to do and keep going in your lane of the freeway, right?
yeah, yeah,
So I want to remind everybody, like, we're talking at a time when connection and communication and distance were hard to overcome.
yeah, yeah,
And people
definitely.
were not educated.
Sorry, I was just, my parents were in another state.
Yes.
They have their own backgrounds that mean that, okay, they weren't as trauma informed as we are these days, let's say. And I didn't have, even at that stage, I think I had one counselling session,
Mm,
and it was a
mm.
guy through the university who was not a good listener and very ready to sign off on whatever piece of paper he had in front of him. So that wasn't helpful at all. So I had no formal supports and no real sort of family supports. I mean, they rang and checked in every week or every other week, and but you do just have to go, yeah, I'm fine. I'm still doing the things. I'm still here. I'm still, I could understand that they were scared for me, and I didn't want to give them a reason to not let me continue dancing, because that was the thing behind me. Um, so yeah, so yes, it was hard, and yes, I was struggling on some levels, but ultimately I was fine, was the narrative I was feeding back home, because
Yeah.
there was no alternative. The alternative was them saying, come back and live with us, and I didn't want that. So yeah, so friendships and people in my dance world and my study space were my people. That's, and really there's a couple of them that got me through. And yeah, it's tricky when you are disconnected by distance and by lack of technology and those sorts of things. And it was a really different time. And I imagine now if the same thing happened, that the experience would be quite different.
Yes. So, one of the things that I say is the body never lies. Long before language, it tells us a story of whether we felt safe or not. You said that your own neurodivergent shapes both your challenges and your strengths. How has that influenced the way you processed the grief and have rebuilt your life afterwards?
A tricky question with a lot of layers. So I guess for people to understand then and now, I was only diagnosed with my neurodivergence at age 50-ish,
Yep.
so relatively recently. But I did from very early on have a pretty clear idea that I was somehow different, that my brain didn't necessarily work in the same way that lots of other people's did. And I was very aware of some social struggles in that I had a really strong sense of justice. I was really good at remembering things, but if something didn't make sense, I couldn't make it stick in my head. And poor Mr. Ryan, my physics teacher, would go, yep, and shake his head, and that'd be the end of that. So when Leigh first died and the years afterwards, really just, I guess, assumed that all of the responses I was having were based on the trauma, even though maybe I didn't have that word trauma in my vocabulary at that stage. But yeah, it makes sense that when something that huge happens and you have to reimagine your perspective on life and your philosophies on what life and death is all about and your worth on this planet and, why we're here in the big picture and all the, massive, massive things for a 20-year-old, 21-year-old to be worrying about, that I just assumed that all my perspectives came from that, aside from the things that I was used to in terms of being a bit quirky or, certain people not understanding me particularly well or feeling frustrated at certain things or being a bit emotional or, yeah. So I was, there were certain aspects of those things that I was well used to and quite okay about living with. But all the stuff that came after that was hard, I think I just put down to the trauma, which, is perfectly understandable. I don't hold any kind of stress over that. But it did make me hypervigilant emotionally. I've certainly done a lot of unpacking since about needing to be ready for anything, being so, overthinking and being so prepared that no matter what happens in life, I have a sense that I can deal with it and that I will deal with it and that I trust myself. And how that shows up is, that overthinking of what if this and what if that, and maybe it could turn out like this and maybe it could turn out like that. And knowing that I have a plan for every single one of those eventualities, which is exhausting. So that's part of it. And it's also in some ways a physical hypervigilance. I see a lot more than other people. I make not even a conscious point anymore, but I do make a point of noticing things. And sometimes I just go, you're not a police detective or whatever. You don't need to notice that odd brown scrap of paper out of context in the park. Nobody's going to come and interview you over a random bag that you saw sitting at the train station. I don't know what, but I still catch myself doing that. I do it far less these days because I know what it is and why I do it. And I've worked hard to try and convince myself that I don't need to do it. But it has left me with an extraordinary range of skills that often come in quite handy, things that I've learnt to do. And I guess a sense of independence, like I need to be whatever I need to cope with, I need to be able to do it for myself, because I learnt that early on, that even though other people can be supportive and helpful and all those things, that ultimately the buck stops with me for my life and my head and my physicality and all of those things. So yeah, really added into that need to be independent and strong and aware and ready, which over time I choose to frame as a positive and use in positive ways. I'm well aware that it came from trauma, and that it would have been relatively easy to be buried under all of that. So I think I've said a lot through my life, that day on the other side of the kitchen door and my innate stubbornness have saved me over and over and over again in life. And maybe that stubbornness is part of the neurodivergence. Maybe that's the ASD. It became a new rule. I will never give in to this. And that's what I've lived by. So on the one hand, yeah, it probably made things harder in, lack of recognition or in overstating social, I look back now and I go, I had that really strong sense that a lot of our peers thought it was my fault. Did they actually? Where did that come from? I don't know. Was that my sensitive neurodivergent brain putting an overlay on the actual situation, or did I hear it from one person and multiply it out across the entire year level or whatever? I don't actually know. So, yeah, there are probably things where my neurodivergent brain took over and did things in a way that weren't helpful. But also understanding how my brain works now and looking back at how I've learnt to thrive since then. Certainly the neurodivergence has been one of the things that's given me strength as well, because I always knew that I was different. So doing things differently, it's just part of who I am. I feel like it would be different if I'd felt like I had this kind of neurotypical life's planned out for me. Things are relatively smooth. Society accepts me exactly as I am and I can move through it without issue. If that had been me, it might have been harder to find a way through. But I was already used to doing things differently. I was already used to having to be relatively independent and have a thick skin and all those kind of things. So in some ways, I think it's helped me as well.
I went to a networking event last night, and not that I'm diminishing the people who are at either ends of the spectrum of neurodiversity and with the different things, but we all think differently. It's really how we're responding to external stimulus and that make us very different, whether we're able to tolerate big crowds and loud noises and all of that. But the fact that we all think differently and to be extremely goal focused and to pay attention to detail is not what everybody does, right? And some of us are just that way.
Yeah.
You've spent so much time alongside neurodivergent students and families. When a child grows up feeling misunderstood or unsafe, what do you notice happening, not just in their behaviour, but in their body and their spirit and their curiosity of how they participate in their life?
Yeah. Obviously it's different for everybody, different brains.
Yeah.
That's kind of the base level response to that question. But I think the type of neurodivergence matters a lot. Kids who are ADHD, particularly hyperactive ADHD, or even the combined type, a lot of that energy is stored in their bodies. And if they don't have a safe and societally appropriate, let's say, way of expending that energy, then the feedback they get is largely negative. And then that in turn turns into a kind of shaming. They force themselves to try and sit still, which holds tension, and emotional baggage comes along with that, and they get to the point where they just can't hold it in anymore and need to explode. And then often the explosions are not particularly healthy, which then in turn has a negative response, and it can become a whole cycle, which is not ideal for them. And, often there are kids with specific learning disorders like dyslexia, dysgraphia, those kinds of things, or even intellectual disabilities or acquired brain injuries, those sorts of things that result in their brains working differently. Often, particularly in a mainstream school setting, there's so much stress around being able to perform, being able to answer, being able to do the work when you're told to do the work, those sorts of things that invariably is held as stress, is often leads to shutdown, kind of undermines any sense of being able to show what they know. In terms of work output. Yeah, and it really can be that negative cycle, and where the like the psychology and the physical aspects of it really are just so tightly woven together that it's sort of hard to separate them.
Yeah.
But that's where, for me, making space for all of that, validating those feelings and experiences, and then helping the students to find words around it, or the kids to find words. Because once you can name and articulate something, it stops people from making assumptions, I guess. If I can say, hey, I've got a lot of energy today, I can't sit still, I really need to burn some of this off before I can expect myself to sit and write an essay, then the person I'm talking to knows that I'm self-aware, that I'm not just trying to get out of it, that I do have a huge amount of energy, that I have a strategy for dealing with it, and that they just need to be accommodating. Whereas if I'm sitting in my chair and fiddling and just not working, and then probably being annoying to somebody else, and then that creates an argumentative situation because the kid next to me goes, stop bumping the table. And I'm going, but I can't help it. And then you end up with this vocal thing that then disrupts the class, and things get out of hand quite quickly. And for me, it's so easy to see the seed where that starts. I'm really quite passionate about, if you can see the seed, identify it, acknowledge it, make space for it, then a lot of the bigger stuff just doesn't happen or doesn't need to happen, in which case then you're preventing the psychological damage of the shaming and the arguments or the discipline at school or the whatever it is, whatever the system is that you're sort of stuck in. So, and I know for myself that when I got diagnosed, I had a huge sense of relief because I suddenly knew, and I had input from a professional, that I wasn't just broken, that I wasn't just bad at being human in a way that other people found really easy and obvious. The things that I'd struggled with, there was a reason for it, and that I could accept it as a difference, where I also had a choice about how to move forward once I'd acknowledged the difference and understood that the differences for me have a lot of strengths. And I know that's not the case for everybody. Some people are really disabled by their difference. And, I'm not trying to undermine that in any way, shape or form. But for me, I do feel quite capable and like I have a lot to offer, and I have a lot of skills that I've developed for whatever trauma-based reasons in the past. But, I'm a person who's going to make the most of that and do good things with it whilsoever I can. And part of that for me is wanting to support kids to understand that it's difference, not necessarily deficit, can be deficit, but, that often there is a way through if you do it differently. And if you understand what you need to do differently, then you can largely avoid that shame cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because in hearing what you're saying, I'm imagining that if the education and conversation were broader to explain what you did about, that self-awareness, I've got excess energy, I need to run, I need to do this, no matter where we are on the spectrum of thinking, right?
Yeah.
Of being, of acting, of feeling. If we're the teacher, we're the student, we're a student, an aide in the room, and whether we're the parents, if we all have that education and we're all able to go, well, right now, I need a pause, or I need, I need silence for 5 minutes, or whatever it is that we need. If we were actually to normalize the fact that what you have learned and what you teach, if we were all able to do that and articulate and be aware enough to know that, I know that as a parent and a grandparent, when I'm frustrated, yesterday I've got inflammation in my skin. It feels like every part of me is sunburnt and sore, and I know that was affecting how I was responding to any thought and any action of my husband. And I was being totally self-obsessed and not understanding that it was actually me who was feeling bad. And I needed to do something about why I was feeling bad. He wasn't making me feel bad.
Yeah. And sometimes, it's quite human to want someone to join us in that feeling, because when you're not feeling great, it feels quite lonely. But yeah, differentiating between when you actually can do something about your own feelings that then impacts the way you respond to people is a totally different strategy than, playing something outward in a way that kind of invites someone to feel bad with you. And, often that's where arguments start because, someone's kind of going, I feel awful. I need to drag you into this awfulness so that I'm not alone. But then we end up in this to and fro argument and then we all feel awful and, well, I'm not alone anymore, but nobody feels better. So it's
Yeah.
not a productive way to do things. Yeah. So I don't know. I kind of feel like, it's not been an easy road, but I certainly feel like I've learnt hell of a lot and my capacity to help people has grown massively. And I really like that. Even when I was a little kid, my mum used to say to me, you find all the lost souls. My first boyfriend when I was about 8, I think, it was our first school camp and there was a disco on the last night and everybody was taking someone to the disco. And I mean, nobody was jumping up and down to take me to the disco, but I wasn't focused on that. I saw this kid and I still remember him clearly. And he had kind of an awkward haircut and big ears and he was quiet and shy and not sporty. And, like he was just not on anybody's radar very much, but he was a sweetie. And I just remember going, I'm going to ask him so that he's got someone to take. And I did. And we decided we were boyfriend and girlfriend that night. And the next day it was over. It was a very short-lived relationship. But, that's just kind of who I am and who I've always been. So I guess even though, I had that life-changing event, and, to be fair, there's probably been a few more since. But it feels good that I still am who I always was in that sense, and that I want to help particularly young people to understand themselves better so that they can avoid some of the sort of secondary trauma that comes with not understanding yourself and living in a world where things are not easy if you're neurodivergent. So, and maybe I feel lucky to be autistic and ADHD because then I feel like I've got 2 bases covered and, I can understand both of those things. And for me, where it lands in the middle, for me, I feel like some of the negatives of both or the potential negatives of both kind of cancel each other out. So, I know it's quite typical of people with ADHD to be terrible at task initiation and sticking to a plan and seeing something through to the end. And I do have lots of wild ideas. My ADHD brain goes absolutely nuts, but my ASD brain kicks right in and refuses to let me do something without finishing it properly and, sticking to the rules and doing it the way it should be done. And so I don't struggle with not finishing things or not being able to start things because I almost feel like I've got 2 halves or 2 little, one on each shoulder that goes, do this fun thing. No, you've got to do it properly, and they kind of balance each other out. And fortunately for me, what I'm left with is this way of understanding lots of things, of being able to see the detail, but also remember the detail and also have the capacity to get really excited by things and interested in new things and do that hyper focus and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of love it, even though it's not the easiest path and lots of people wouldn't choose it, but I kind of love it.
And that is loving the skin you're in, right?
Yeah.
That's loving. There is a benefit. I see myself in you. I am the ADHD brain and I am the obsessed to get to the end and I'm the over responsible person and I care deeply about how I impact others and that they have a better life. So I know that. And if I can't fight for me, I can damn well fight for others. So from an advocacy point of view and making the world different and the highlighting the unspoken problems, I'll be there every day of the week.
Yeah. Well, and there you go. That's why we connected over lunch, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Now, I know that we could have a 3-hour podcast. This, it makes so much sense. And I've got so many more questions. However, the reality is that we come across We get so much information, and then it is our responsibility to seek more information, right? And the opportunity for people who've heard our discussion today is for them to decide that they want to know more. You know, they can seek you out. I'll make sure that they're aware of how they can contact you. They can just think about the thoughts that we've talked about, and they can see that there's joy in overcoming adversity.
Absolutely.
There is immense sadness at times, and that never goes away.
No,
because, we want nobody to feel alone, and we want nobody to feel that they can't get support in some way. But, maybe Leigh gifted you with some passion, some deeper growth. Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? But he's in your heart and
absolutely.
he's in your thoughts, and you are an amazing person from choosing to live every day, consciously choosing that being here is the place to be and making a difference is the thing to do. So, Katie, thank you for letting us walk beside you today. Not just through the heartbreak of that 19-year-old moment, but through the woman you've become because of it. You've shown us that grief can live quietly inside the body, that misunderstanding can echo for decades, and that real safety, the kind that allows a nervous system to rest, is where healing begins. Your story reminds us that when we meet pain with curiosity instead of judgment, we don't just heal ourselves, we change what's possible for those who come after us. Every classroom, every child, every parent who feels seen because of you, because you kept talking and became part of the ripple, is benefited. If today's conversation has touched something tender in you, please reach out. In Australia, you can contact Lifeline on 131114. If you are listening elsewhere, please reach out to your local mental health helpline or someone you trust, because you never have to carry it alone. This has been Suddenly Different, stories and strategies for when life doesn't go to plan. Until next time, may you give yourself permission to pause, to breathe, and to remember, even in the aftermath, there is still light, there is still life, and there is always a way to begin again. Thank you so much, Katie, for coming on to Suddenly Different today and for being in my life.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honour. It's great. Thanks, Leigh-Anne.
Thank you. This has been Suddenly Different. I'm Leigh-Anne Charland, and I'm so grateful you shared your time with me. If you felt a spark, a tear, or a moment of recognition, I hope you'll pass that gift along by sharing this show. Take a deep breath, trust your path, and I'll meet you back here soon.